My name is Marlene Schwartz, and I am the director of the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity, and I'll be talking about some of the work that we've done on school food and wellness. The reason that we focused on school food is really because it's one of the places where you can reach the most children. The National School Lunch Program serves over 31 million children every day and has access to 95% of all American children. There's also a precedent for schools to set higher safety and health standards than other settings. So when parents send their children to school, they really expect that they're going to be in a safe environment. They're not going to be exposed to, for example, chemicals or other dangerous things. So there's really a way of thinking in our culture about schools as a place that are taking that extra step to be as safe as possible. Another reason that schools are a great place to try to make changes to improve diet is that they are a natural place to combine education and environmental changes. So they not only have the cafeteria where all of the children go to eat, but they can also communicate positive messages through nutrition in the classroom. They make sure that the hallways and public spaces in the school are reinforcing positive messages and not marketing unhealthy products. And the school grounds as well are a place to make sure that they're promoting healthy products and promoting a good diet as opposed to selling or advertising unhealthy foods. So in 2006, the federal government required that all schools participating in one of the federal food programs write a school wellness policy. And this was a really new idea where the districts are asked to create a representative group, and it needed to include parents, students, teachers, administrators, the food service, and other people from the community. And they needed to decide how their district was going to address nutrition education, nutrition standards for all of the foods in the school, goals for physical activity, and a plan for measuring the implementation. And so this was the first time that there was really a national drive to get school districts to come up with some sort of plan to address wellness in their schools. And it was a wonderful thing because it really got the issue on the radar of the school districts because it was required. So we've done quite a bit of research looking at school wellness policies, both in Connecticut and other parts of the country. And one of the things that we and others have found is that the way that these policies are written really makes a difference. So if a policy is written to be very strong, use language like shall or will, that really was helpful in creating consistency over time, that the policy would sort of stand and keep the changes as even if administrators and teachers and students changed. It also meant that those schools would have healthier food environments. So a study that we did in Connecticut found that the more strongly worded the policy, the better changes you saw in the cafeterias. And you could measure how the competitive foods or the foods that are sold outside the lunch program really improved in those districts that took on a strong policy. Another study that we did in Connecticut found that the more strongly written the policy was, the better the implementation of the practices. So one of the concerns about just requiring a policy but not necessarily requiring specific changes is that people will write the policy, it will get put on a shelf, and no one will ever implement it. But our work in Connecticut found that when we surveyed principals and food service directors to find out what had actually changed in their schools before and after the policy went into effect, that the more strongly written the policy, the stronger the changes. So we took the measure that we developed as part of this research and put it online because we wanted it to be available to people in other parts of the country who wanted to look at their district wellness policy. So the website is WellSat at WELLSAT.org. And if you go on there, you can put in information about your district and you can code your policy. So if you have the policy in front of you, the questions will ask you about particular issues, whether or not they're addressed in your policy, and then you will be helped in scoring your policy to figure out how strongly worded it is. And this can sometimes be really helpful if a committee is thinking about revising its policy. If someone goes on and codes the current policy, we can point out exactly what resources are out there to help you strengthen different components of your policy. So, some of the current issues that are facing the whole movement of improving schools and wellness have to do with the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, which was passed in 2010. So, there are a few things in that act that are really exciting for people who are interested in this area. The first is that the USDA was asked to update the National School Lunch Program guidelines, which it did, and those changes went into effect last fall. So, among the changes are having calorie limits as well as calorie minimums, having different ranges of calories depending on the age of the child, and then requiring much more diversity among the fruits and vegetables that are offered so that schools really can expose children to a lot of different types of produce, as well as changing the policy slightly so that in order for the lunch to be a reimbursable school lunch, it used to be you needed to take 3 out of any of the 5 components offered. And the 5 components were a fruit, a vegetable, a milk, a protein, and a bread or a grain group. Now one of those 3 components needs to be the fruit or the vegetable. And that change just by itself has made a big difference in the amount of fruits and vegetables that are being served to children across the country. Another difference that we can expect to see has to do with competitive foods. So, as I said, those are the foods that are sold in competition with the National School Lunch Program. Some districts have chosen to eliminate those foods altogether and only sell the school lunch, but a lot of districts feel like they want to offer more choices to their students. So historically, those have been completely unregulated. They've very minimum standards of a small group of foods you couldn't sell, but things like ice cream, potato chips, things like that that clearly are unhealthy foods were allowed to be sold as competitive foods. So the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act required that the USDA update the regulations for those foods, and that is very new, very exciting. And back in the spring of 2013, the USDA released its rule of what the competitive foods are going to be. And so they are now working on an implementation plan. So we should be seeing really significant changes in the next couple of years in terms of what foods are being sold in cafeterias and hallways outside of the school lunch. And then finally, there's this special case of sugar-sweetened beverages. Because sugar-sweetened beverages are so uniquely tied to childhood obesity, there have been a lot of places around the country that have tried to eliminate them from the school setting. And a number of states, Connecticut was among the first in 2006, have actually passed state legislation to eliminate sugar-sweetened beverages from schools. So, for example, in Connecticut, only water, juice, and milk can be sold K through 12. But nationally, there were still many places that had these beverages in their schools. There had been some efforts on the part of the beverage industry to self-regulate and eliminate some of the beverages from schools, and there's mixed evidence as to how effective that has been. But the good news is that the new competitive food rules from the USDA should pretty comprehensively take those beverages out of the schools. So things like full-calorie soft drinks should not be in the schools after the new regulations are implemented. So one of the nice things about this area is there's both research, but there's also a lot of advocacy in terms of improving the school setting. And some of the experiences I've had, as well as colleagues of mine who've done this work, might be helpful to know. The first thing is if you're going into a school district and you're trying to make changes, it helps to have data. So one of the things that I did in my school district when I was trying to advocate for better environments for the kids was the first thing was to actually do a survey of parents and try to find out how parents in your community feel about these issues. Because when you do that, you can have a lot more confidence that when you go to a board of education or the superintendent that you have parents in your community that back you up. A second piece of information that's extremely helpful to have is BMI, or body mass index data. And the reason this is helpful is because BMI is really a great surveillance tool. It's not necessarily a diagnostic tool. It won't necessarily tell you if one particular individual is obese, but when you use it in large groups of people, it can tell you overall what your rates of obesity are in the group. And so what's nice is that if you get BMI data from your school district, and many school districts collect this, you have a good sense of what the overall rates of obesity are, and you can then track them over time to see if they are improving as changes are being made in your community. And one of the things that's also useful about BMI data is some school districts really don't feel that they have a problem with childhood obesity, and the individuals who work there don't necessarily think that the children are impacted by this. But unfortunately, it's a pretty safe bet that if you collect BMI data, you will find that indeed a significant number of children are affected. But because the changes have happened slowly over time, it's not always obvious to people that the rates have climbed so much in communities where they don't necessarily think that they struggle with this. Another great way to look at what's happening in your school district is to do a nutrition survey of the students. So the idea here is to use, it can be a fairly simple survey asking students about what they ate the day before or how frequently they eat certain foods. And that's another way to look at both where you are when you start and how things change over time. So in our district, we were able to do a survey and find that kids were actually eating 3 times as many servings of things like ice cream and potato chips, and they were only eating half the fruits and vegetables that they needed. And so that was really helpful when we argued that the elementary schools needed to take the potato chips and ice cream out. And then finally, these changes always have a financial impact, and sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative, and it's important to just pay attention to that. Food services are required to cover their costs in most places, and so you want to really work in collaboration with your food service director to track the financial impact of these changes and try to really promote the National School Lunch Program. The research on this has shown that when you take the unhealthy competitive foods out, your participation in the school lunch program typically goes up. And so what that does is it tends to compensate for any lost revenue from selling fewer snack foods. So that may not happen in every single district, but that's definitely what's happened in the majority of districts that have made these changes. I also think it's important to pick your first set of battles. A lot of times parents go into their school system and they have a very long list of all the things that they would like changed. But you want to take them one at a time because change is hard and can happen slowly. And a lot of times it's easiest to start with the youngest children. So improving the food sold in the elementary school cafeterias, working on maybe getting a school garden in an elementary school, increasing people's awareness of nutrition can be a really good place to start. You also have to anticipate that not everyone is going to agree with you. I have learned this lesson the hard way, that there definitely are people who believe that the school shouldn't be taking a stand on these issues, that there shouldn't be any limits to what's sold in the schools. Fortunately, that attitude is much less common than it was 15 years ago. But if you are going to become an advocate in your district, you need to have a relatively, thick skin and be prepared that there will be some people who might not be happy. I also think it's important that once you do this, you are consistent in your words and actions. So sometimes that may not be very fun. So for example, if you are advocating for a policy that parties don't happen in the elementary schools that involve lots of candy and cupcakes, you need to be prepared to kind of put your actions where your mouth is. So for example, in our district, the rule is on Valentine's Day, you can bring in Valentines, but you don't hand out candy with the Valentines. And you have to be tough and tell your child when they want to get the Valentines that have the chocolate attached that no, you can't get that kind, and you need to follow the rules with your own kids. And finally, it's really important to be persistent. I've been working in this area for many years now, and I've seen a lot of changes, but there have been times where it's felt really difficult and I worried that change was not going to happen. But you need to stick with it, you need to keep at it, and eventually things will change. And our society has changed enough now that the idea of getting unhealthy food out of schools is much more accepted than it was back about 10 years ago. So finally, we have a website at the Rudd Center called Rudd Roots Parents, And it's designed to really provide a lot of tools and information and a forum for parents who are interested in making these changes. So I encourage you to visit that site. Thank you.